I'm sorry not to be able to be with you in person today, but I appreciate your listening. What I want to do in my time today is to make the case for why AI needs the humanities. I'll begin by giving you a very brief history of the intersection of AI and the humanities before describing some of my own recent research in this area. And then I'll conclude by proposing one possible path forward. My overall goal with this talk is to demonstrate how the types of questions that humanities scholars ask about the objects of culture, about the contexts that surround them, and about the people who make them are not simply relevant to AI research, but are in fact deeply necessary if AI is to address today's most urgent research challenges, and in particular, those having to do with the ethical design of AI system and their potential for harm, as well as their transformative possibilities. With that said, I wasn't exactly sure how I should begin to convey to you the current lay of the land in terms of AI and humanities research. And so I went in search of some resources that might provide some guidance and some insight. The first two things I looked at were The Future of Humanity and the book, What Humans Will Do When AI Becomes Real. No, that's actually not true. What I did was go to a web-based implementation of the Inference Api for GPT-2. This is a form of AI that's known as a large language model. I typed in the first half of the sentence that I just spoke aloud, which you can see up here. And then I pressed tab and tab again, such that phrase by phrase, the model predicted the words that were most likely to come next. The predictions were made on the basis of a neural network, which was trained on text that actually was written by humans, and more specifically, on what was written on 45 million web pages that were posted as links to Reddit between 2005 and 2017. The text prediction capabilities of GPT-2, they're actually pretty good, as evinced by these other possibilities that I generated and just as easily could have spoken aloud. But GPT-2 isn't even close to being state of the art. It was released in 2019, which is ancient history in technical terms. Since 2019, language model sizes have been increasing by an order of magnitude each year, with an accompanying increase in performance across various domains. These range from text prediction, like this up on the screen, to language translation, to image generation. And from the outset, it's really important to acknowledge that as their size and performance increase, these models also carry with them increased potential for harm, as well as significant environmental impacts. And I'll return to these really important points later in my talk. But the point that I want to make now, which will bring me into the history of AI and the humanities, is that while the processing power that has enabled us to train these larger and larger models, this is relatively new. The deep neural network architecture that they rely upon, this dates to the early 1990s. So at this point, it's nearly 30 years old. And the basic idea to model an electrical system after neurons in the brain, this was theorized even earlier in the 1940s. So this was a decade before even the first computer was even built. The long history of neural networks is fairly well known, but perhaps less well known is that for just as long, humanities scholars have been thinking about how advances in computation, including but not limited to neural networks, could be applied to their own research. So here you see on the left, the Italian punch card operators who were involved in the creation of the Index Thomisticus. This is a catalog of every word used in the writings of Thomas Aquinas. This work began in 1949. After the Project PI visited IBM's New York office and identified the potential of what was then described as a, quote, electronic calculating punch. But earlier in that decade at Berkeley in California, an English professor by the name of Josephine Miles began work on a large-scale study of words and phrases in early modern poetry. You can see some of her slightly later work from the 1950s in the image on the right. Fast forward to the present, and we see these two fields directly converging. So for example, this project, released just a few months ago, uses a deep neural network architecture very similar to the text prediction system that I began with today, but in this case to predict the missing letters from fragmented Greek artifacts. This system outperforms people, but notably it achieves its best accuracy, about 72%, when employed by historians who are already experts in this area. My own research also makes use of deep learning and AI more broadly to explore questions of gender, race, and justice, both as these questions emerge in the 18th and 19th centuries and as they persist in the present. And in the next section of my talk, I'm going to discuss a pair of examples from the projects that you see up here, both to continue to make the case for how AI can contribute to humanities research, and to begin to gesture towards the larger questions that I mentioned at the outside of my talk, about AI as a product of culture, about the people who are and who are not reflected in that culture, and about how humanities scholars, and not only those who employ computational methods, are ideally positioned to contribute to the current conversation about AI and its potential benefits, as well as its potential harms. So what you're looking at here on the right are some of the newspapers that, in digitized form, constitute the data for one of these projects. It's called Vectors of Freedom. And in this project, I use a range of machine learning methods, along with some ideas from network science, in order to tease apart the vexed racial politics of the abolitionist movement of the 19th century United States. And just a bit more by way of context, these newspapers function in effect as the social media of their day. They were widely read, circulated, and shared. All of the editors of all of the papers read each other's work. And because they predated our modern conception of copyright, newspapers very often reprinted contents from other newspapers as a sign of endorsement. So you could think of this as the 19th century version of the retweet. It's also important to know that these newspapers were edited by a multiracial coalition of men and also women at a time of otherwise fairly rigid social segregation, both in terms of race and of gender, which in turn reflected the composition of the movement itself, which consisted of both men and women, both Black and white, both in the US and abroad, including the UK, and I'll come back to British abolition in a minute. And yet, when the story of abolition is commonly told, it tends to center on only a few prominent individuals. Folks like the Black author and activist Frederick Douglass, who himself had been enslaved, and the white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who was known for his fiery writing style. And I should note also that it's not a coincidence that both of these very famous figures happen to be men. Because one of the things that we know based on really fantastic qualitative scholarship, and also just from reading these newspapers, is that there was a far wider range of actors, including women, as well as modes of political action, including collective action, that enabled the end of slavery to come about. So here you see on the left, what is probably one of the most famous lines from these newspapers, authored by William Lloyd Garrison. And on the right, you see a very similar proclamation authored by Marianne Shadd. She was a Black woman abolitionist who was far less widely known. So one of the first questions we thought to ask in this project had to do with what it meant to have, quote, broken the editorial ice. In other words, could we use AI to detect additional ways in which Shadd's newspaper, as much as Garrison's, shaped the conversation about abolition? I'm using we here because part of the project was collaborative work with Jacob Eisenstein, my colleague at Georgia Tech, and now at Google AI, and a grad student from Georgia Tech, Sandeep Soni, who's now a postdoc at Berkeley. And what we did first was to create a machine learning model of language change so that we could analyze the literal terms of debate. But the next step in our process was to aggregate these hundreds of word changes so that we could get a big picture view of which newspapers were consistently responsible for introducing new or changed word meanings into this discourse. And you do find Garrison's newspaper up at the top in terms of introducing word changes that others would quickly follow. but you also see Shad's newspaper over here, close to the top as well. So here we have a new layer of evidence in support of Shad's self-account of, quote, breaking the editorial ice, as well as in support of recent qualitative research that has sought to position her as a pivotal figure in the abolitionist movement. And this is not the type of evidence that could be gained from reading alone. And yet we also know, not from the model, but again from Shad's own writing, that restoring credit to Shad for how she shaped the discourse of the abolitionist movement would still not account for all of the work that she did to support the abolitionist cause, the, quote, difficulties that she encountered, as you see on the screen, that were the result of not only issues of gender, but also of race. This was, very importantly, the point in the project when we put our model to rest and turned to more traditional modes of humanistic inquiry. There's a lot more that I could say about these theories and how they shaped our findings. But for now, I want to use this project to come back to the main point of my talk today about why AI needs the humanities. And this is something which I think almost everyone listening would agree. No model, however large, can capture the full range of human experience, or even the full extent of the specific phenomenon being studied. Now, this doesn't mean that we should stop modeling these things, as there is tremendous value in what we can learn from these approaches. But it does mean that we must remain open to additional methods of inquiry, those that can even further enhance what we might learn from AI. These methods, which have to do with the meaning that can be gained from individual stories, with the significance that can be gained with recourse to theoretical concepts, and with the knowledge that can be made more precise by placing these stories in their broader contexts. These are the methods that humanities scholars are trained in our work to do. And when we bring them to the design and analysis of AI systems, they can vastly increase our ability to give meaning to the patterns that these systems learn. I'm going to turn to another current project of mine to continue to elaborate this point about how the methods that humanities scholars are trained to employ, as well as the questions that we are trained to ask, can enhance the meaning that we derive from AI systems, as well as the ways that we think to put them to use. And I should say also that up till now, I've bracketed the major ethical issues that come along with the proliferation of AI systems. But here is where I'll return to them. Because it's not only by asking questions about the meaning of these systems, but also about the people who shape them, that we can identify the larger structural forces that are to blame for so much of the bias and outright harm that these systems produce. This project is called Data by Design. It doesn't have as much to do with AI as it has to do with data in general and data visualization in particular. But I see these very much as allied fields. And before I keep going, I should say that this is also a collaborative project consisting of myself along with 2 Georgia Tech undergrads, Danju Tan and Jianing Fu, an NYU master's student, Tanvi Sharma, and 2 Emory undergrads, Anna Mola and Zhu Feng. What we're trying to do with this project, which will ultimately be published as a web-based book, is make the point that the act of visualizing data is never theory or context-free. In order to do this, we turn to a series of touchstones from the history of data visualization and use both textual analysis and visualizations that we've designed ourselves in order to illustrate the ideological assumptions and cultural values that are embedded in all instances of visual display. I bring this project up now, though, because of one particular instance that I hope will help to drive home the point about the role of the people who shape these cultural values, as well as the objects of culture that they create. This is a point that applies equally to AI, since AI is also a product of culture and reflects the ideas and assumptions of the people who contribute to it. The instance I'll share begins with one person in particular, a man named Olaudah Equiano. Most humanities scholars know Equiano as the author of the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa the African. The book was published in 1789 and remains one of the best-known autobiographies by an African person who had been enslaved. Sort of with an asterisk, because recent scholarship has suggested that the autobiography may be more fictional than Equiano would like us to believe. But in any case, the book tells the story of Equiano's capture in what is now Benin, the trauma of the Middle Passage, and his 20-year period of enslavement, during which he continually plotted to secure his freedom. After Equiano emancipated himself, he moved to London, where he became a prominent abolitionist. And it was because of this activist work that just a few months before his narrative was released, he received a visit from a colleague named Thomas Clarkson. So here's Clarkson. Clarkson was an abolitionist, also living in London, and a key member of one of the more prominent white-led anti-slavery groups of the time. Now, we don't know much about the conversation that transpired, but the end result was that Equiano agreed to formally endorse an image that had recently been sent to Clarkson from a group in Plymouth, and that Clarkson planned to make the centerpiece of his own group's anti-slavery campaign. Now, I'm going to show you the image, which may be familiar to some of you. It's called Plan of an African Slave Ship. And what it shows is the required arrangement of the bodies of the captive Africans as they were forced to endure the Middle Passage. And I want to preface this by saying that it's a very upsetting image to behold. So part of this long introduction is to prepare you for that. So now I'll show it to you. You can see how it shows the configuration of these captive bodies and the extent of the inhumanity of this horrific trip. Now, this image, it's inspired a number of highly influential works in the humanities, but it's rarely discussed in the context of data visualization, even though technically that's what this image is. So if you read about the research that went into the creation of the chart, you find that Thomas Elford, the person who first sketched the image, undertook a significant data collection effort, which involved covertly copying information from the muster rolls that were kept in sailors' social halls. He also supplemented his data with qualitative research, primarily through interviews with disillusioned sailors. In any case, the point that I make in my analysis of this image and the project has to do with Clarkson's design goals. And as he later explained, the image was designed to create, quote, an instantaneous impression in all those who saw it. And this was an impression that he hoped would compel additional white British citizens to join the abolitionist cause. And this idea of producing an instantaneous impression in the viewer, this anticipates a lot of the rhetoric about data visualization today, where you hear people talking about how visualization produces these aha moments, where the significance of the data suddenly snaps into view. But that power is actually only 1/2 of the constitutive tension of data visualization. So if you think about the abstraction that is required to distill the significance from the data, so this is like what viz researchers call insight, and posit really as the ultimate goal of visualization. This insight always, and in fact necessarily, comes at the expense of the particularities of the data itself, in this case, the actual human lives that the data represents. This tension, it's far less evident in the set of images that are generally upheld as the first instances of modern data visualization. So here you're looking at a chart created by William Playfair, a Scottish political economist who is often described as the father of modern data visualization. If you look at the caption, you can see this dates from only 1 year earlier than Plan of the Slave Ship. And like Clarkson, Playfair also wanted to create an instantaneous impression in all who saw it. And he actually uses very similar language to make his agenda clear. But because Playfair's time series charts depict the financial data of empire, as opposed to its actual human costs, we tend to think only about the first half of that constitutive tension I just proposed, just the insight-producing power of visualization, and not the reminder that there are always people behind the data that we're making insights about. These are the people who decide to offer up their lives as data, or whose lives become captured as data without their consent. And in my view, today's AI systems are characterized by a similar tension. As they attempt to model aspects of human intelligence, and make predictions on the basis of that model, they're required to group together similar data or make connections between past events. But this process of grouping together of what is in effect abstraction, it necessarily results in a loss of specificity. This specificity is what keys us into the significance of individual stories and to the cultural forces that determine which stories even get to be told at all. And yet this specificity is precisely the thing that these systems are designed to abstract away. And therefore they require additional methods, additional humanistic methods in order to bring back into view. Which is a long way of saying that when humanities scholars see headlines about all of the biases embedded in AI systems or the harms that they inadvertently produce, we're rarely surprised, because we recognize how these systems emerge from the data of culture. And unless we ask questions about the construction of culture, about whose voices a culture amplifies and whose voices it omits, these systems will continue to reflect dominant cultures alone. These cultures are often racist and often sexist, as indicated by the headlines I put up on the screen. And to be perfectly honest, as these systems are becoming increasingly pervasive and as the corporations that deploy them display increasing inattention to their harms, it's not clear to me that there's an easy ethical path through. But if we are to find a way to move forward, it will only be with the added expertise of humanities scholars. Because humanities scholars are deeply attuned to the power asymmetries that shape the cultural record, what we might more formally call the archive. From our earliest days in graduate school, we learned that the documents that we can access, in other words, our data sets, these directly impact the research questions that we in turn can ask. For those of us who work on histories of race and gender in particular, the bias embedded in the cultural record is the starting point for our work. It's what we decide to do next with that record, whether we attempt to enrich it, more fully contextualize it, theorize its omissions, or contest it altogether, that determines the true contribution of our work. Which brings me really to the final point that I want to make, which is that AI research must necessarily include the study of the cultures from which AI emerges, and the stories of the people whom it impacts, and the long, complex histories that have brought us to this point. It's a foundational feminist claim that all of us can benefit by pooling the knowledge that each of us brings to the table. And given the current stakes of AI research and the tremendous complexity of the challenges we must confront, if there's one thing I truly believe, it's that all of us from all of the disciplines must contribute together, both in the form of the work that I've shown you today and in the work that's yet to come. Thank you so much for listening to this talk. While I'm not around to answer your questions in person, I welcome you to contact me at any of the ways that are up here on the screen. And I look forward to hearing your questions and your ideas. Thank you so much.